it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video I'm so excited for because I'm going to be chatting through my priority reads of 2025. First and foremost, I am still very much in denial that we are even in a new year. That being said though, beginning of the year content and end of the year content is some of my favorite to film. In particular, my priority TBR is one of my favorite videos. It really gives me an opportunity to take a step back, look at my bookshelves and really distill down like what are my priority reads for books that I already own for this upcoming year. With that in mind, I obviously am looking to tackle some significant fantasy series I have not started yet. I also want to wrap up a few other fantasy series that I didn't quite prioritize in 2024. Last year, I completed a lot of series and I want to make sure I continue that momentum into this year. I also completed some very long series I have been on a journey with now for multiple years. So I do feel like I finally have the space in my life to maybe start some new very intense series. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into my 2025 priority TBR. First up, I have the Age of Madness Trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. I read the First Law trilogy a few years ago. I read all of Joe Abercrombie's standalone novels last year. So this year, I hope to read the entirety of this trilogy, starting with A Little Hatred. This book is actually on my January TBR. This is something I hope to really prioritize in the early parts of this year. One, I really love Joe Abercrombie's writing, and I always feel like it's good practice to start out the year with books that you really feel like you're going to give 5 out of 5 stars with. I have adored Joe Abercrombie's writing immensely. I also feel like every book I read of his just gets better and better. His characters are so interesting and complex. His plots always keep me on the edge of my seat. And in general, I find his writing to be very distinct and unique. Like every book sort of delivers something new and fresh. Like nothing feels too repetitive, which I also really appreciate. In particular, he is a grimdark fantasy writer, so his books are very gruesome, very bloody, very violent, and very morally gray with the characters and sort of the plot lines that you get to experience. This trilogy is set in the same world and sort of political atmosphere of the other books of his that we've read, but I think we're following a new cast of characters and a little bit of time has also passed. I feel like he really balances like interesting politics, great character work, while still keeping like a larger scope, which you would anticipate within a high fantasy story. I just really like Joe Abercrombie's writing, so I really want to read not just A Little Hatred, but the entire trilogy in 2025. Next up is a carryover from 2024, a series I did not get to, and I'm super disappointed I didn't make the time for it, so it's definitely a priority read for me this year, and be sure to yell at me if I do not get to it, and that is the Dandelion Dynasty Trilogy by Ken Liu, the first one being The Grace of Kings. I have heard nothing but fantastic things about Ken Liu's writing. In particular, this book I feel like is a very broad reaching first novel within a fantasy trilogy. I believe this almost reads like a history or an epic, and then the later installments sort of drill down in more specifics following like a tighter cast of characters. This takes place on one particular landmass, and previously this land was divided into 7 competing kingdoms, which was full of war and conflict. But before the start of this novel, an empire actually united all of these kingdoms together, and people thought finally peace and prosperity would rule the land. Instead, it's brought stagnation and suffering to the people living here, and now rebellion is brewing at the beginning of this novel. We follow a slew of characters across the entire expanse of this landscape, all with different backgrounds, political affiliations. I feel like this is going to be so interesting, very intense. I'm also hoping it's kind of like a slow build. I love Robin Hobb, and now that I've completed the Realm of the Elderlings, I'm kind of seeking something new that has a really satisfying, slow build, like plot payoff, and I feel like this might be the ticket. The next book I'm about to show off is the first book to a very long, very lauded fantasy series, and I feel like this is going to be kind of kicking off a multi-year journey. Again, I feel like I have space for it, especially because I have finished, you know, things like this and things like this, but the book I'm talking about is the Gardens of the Moon, or the first book to the Malazan series by Steven Erikson. Malazan fans are very intense and they adore this series more than anything else in this entire world. I also feel like there's something about the Malazan series that's always just a little bit intimidating. The books are dense, they're long. A lot of people say that there's not necessarily a consistent through line with the plots, but also everyone also lauds the writing, the world building, just the epic scope of everything occurring within this many book series. So you know what? I'm excited to finally take the plunge and check it out for myself. I also just want to be able to compare compare it to some of my other favorite fantasy series out there, and I actually feel like based off of the inputs of this could be something I would really, really enjoy. The series is set in an empire that is simmering with discontent. It's also bled dry by never-ending war. There are infighting and bloody confrontations with sorcerers, but the Empress continues to rule with an iron fist. I believe we're following a variety of characters, but in this book, I think we're introduced to a group of soldiers specifically. The thing with the Malazan series is I do believe like every book really features like a specific set of characters that aren't necessarily connected, which honestly intrigues me. I love to have multiple viewpoints across a fantasy landscape from lots of different places. So yes, starting Malazan in 2025. We'll see when I finish it, but I'm hoping to at least read like at least 4 books of this year, 1 a quarter. The next fantasy series I also hope to start this year is The Killing Moon by N.K. Jemisin. I do believe this is like my final N.K. Jemisin series I have not started yet. N.K. Jemisin is one of my all-time favorite fantasy writers. Just her plots, characters, and writing style is just something I adore immensely. So I'm honestly surprised I haven't read this yet, but it finally feels like it's time to pick it up. The synopsis of this one does sound really interesting, and I know that like politics and morality are going to take a center stage within whatever happens within this, and I just know N.K. Jemisin is going to get me thinking. But this book is set in this sort of ancient empire where peace rules above all, and there are basically these watchers who roam the rooftops of this city at night, and they go into the citizens' dreams and pull out the magic that exists within these spaces. They also root out like any dissident feeling, and if they catch you in your dreams, they basically like take you to another place. Like they destroy you, they remove you from the empire at large. But at the beginning of this book, some sort of significant like political situation occurs where a lot of corruption or like something comes to light, which sort of rocks the foundations of this empire. And our main character was actually one of these watchers, and I think they're feeling like a strong sense of dissonance and like what to do and how to move forward. Very intrigued by this. I want to say this is N.K. Jemisin's like first fantasy series too, so I'm curious to see like how our writing has grown and changed from this point. I also feel like this might be a little more achievable to actually like complete this year relative to things like Malazan I hope to read. The next fantasy book that's on my priority TBR is City of Last Chances by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This author is really known for his sci-fi works, but he has put out 2 novels within this fantasy series that sounds really interesting. It is a fantasy series that very much centers revolution, and I also believe the stylization between books 1 and 2 are actually quite distinct from each other. Book 1 more so introduces us to the city that the story takes place in, which is Ilmar, which has been crushed under the occupation of another group. And I believe in book 1, structurally speaking, we are reading from a huge cast of characters. So many different people living in this city from all different walks of life, from a factory worker to a criminal in the underground to a baker, just so many different individual people. And through their chapters, we begin to see the buildup of the rebellion that is about to break out in this city and empire. You see that sort of simmer turn into a full boil. I'm really intrigued by this. I feel like this is going to be a very unique fantasy novel, which I always love to pick up and check out. I also feel like I've heard fantastic things about the second novel, which again appears to be structurally quite different than the first. Cover's amazing. I really want to read and check out this author, and if I like this, I also own quite a few of his sci-fi novels as well, so this is also a book I hope to get to quite soon. And the last 2 fantasy series I'm going to feature are 2 series I've also already started and just want to work to complete before the end of the year. First is the Madness Trilogy by James Islington. I read The Will of the Many a couple years ago and really enjoyed it, and I also read the first book of this last year and liked it. I didn't love it, but I did feel it had a lot of potential. It also was very much a quick read, and the characters were likable, and the plot really built on itself throughout the first one. And a lot of people say that books 2 and 3 are even better than book 1. I also feel like this author's just like super popular right now, so I want to be sure to stay on top of all of his releases. But this is another Roman-inspired series that is also multi-POV. It's basically set in a fantasy landscape where these once all-powerful gods ruled. There was also humans that kind of ruled alongside them, and they were both politically powerful, but they also had magical abilities gifted to them from these gods. However, though, before the start of this novel, there was a rebellion overthrowing these gods, as well as these humans that oversaw them, and these humans now had to forsake their powers and now have their magic sort of locked up and controlled by this new government regime. In this series, we're introduced again to a slew of characters. One of them is a young man who is currently in this like magical academy that the government runs, and he's kind of learning how to control his powers, but he discovers at the beginning of book one his powers are kind of going beyond the expectations of the other students around him and might actually be connected to these long defeated gods, which obviously very much complicates his life. Quests, journey, friendship, political intrigue, lots of drama, rebellion sort of unfold from there. It feels like very classic fantasy with a lot of action. I love quests. I love friendship-centered fantasy stories. So I want to continue on with books 2, but also book 3. And then the last fantasy series that's on my priority TBR for the year is the Rare Revelation series by Michael J. Sullivan. I adore Michael J. Sullivan's writing so much. His Legends of the First Empire series was a series I read a few years ago and just loved through and through. One of my favorite fantasy series of all time. Obviously, I want to continue on with this other series set in the same world, and I have been working my way through slowly the Rare Revelation series. There are 3 books within this trilogy, but every book contains 2 novels within it, so it's really like 6 books within bind-ups, if that makes sense. I've read the first 3 books, so I'm like halfway through bind-up number 2. I will say every book within this series does get better and better, so I really want to make sure I finish this and also check out the 3rd bind-up before the end of the year. This is a story that introduces us to our 2 main characters, Royce and Hadrian, and they're kind of 2 swords for hire that also have a very endearing friendship and relationship. One is a very tall, boisterous sort of character. The other is more quiet and reserved, and their back and forth is just like a very endearing situation. At the beginning of book 1, they're basically hired to steal a sword, but in doing so, they're basically framed for the murder of the king, which obviously sets off a variety of events that sort of centers them in some very intense political like machinations. It's also really interesting to read this series with having read the Legends of the First Empire series first, which is a prequel series that takes place like thousands and thousands of years prior to the start of this novel. It very much informs like a lot of the religion and folklore that sort of roots the land that these characters exist in. So it's just like very interesting. I've enjoyed the first 3 installments. I haven't loved any of them, but I do find them to be like quick and fun reads. So again, I'm just hoping to continue that momentum into this year and reading the entirety of this series and finally crossing it off my list. Alrighty friends, let's move into the sci-fi novels I hope to definitely read in 2025. The first book I'm so looking forward to finally picking up, and that is Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. This is an author just in general I'm hoping to read quite a bit more of in 2025. His novels to me feel like they could be the perfect combination of something that one would really get me thinking but are also weird and just very engaging. Annihilation is a very famous novel and is the first book to a trilogy, and basically it introduces us to this area called Area X. And Area X has been cut off from the rest of like humanity now for decades. And nature has completely reclaimed this area, and humanity keeps trying to like check out what exactly happened in this area, and they keep sending expeditions, but every one of these expeditions ends in tragedy in its own unique way. And now in this novel, we are following the 12th expedition of 4 women traveling to Area X to see if they can finally glean what in the world is going on. We follow an anthropologist, a surveyor, and a psychologist, and the de facto leader, who is also our narrator, a biologist. Their mission is to map the terrain, record all observations of their surroundings, and above all, avoid being contaminated by whatever exists within Area X. I feel like this is going to be super intense and very much a page turner. I'm looking forward to finally starting this trilogy, and obviously I hope to read books 2 and 3 as well. Next up is a very popular sci-fi series that I started last year and want to continue on this year, and that is the Sun Eater series by Christopher Riccio. Last year, I read the first book and read about halfway through the second book. It's a series I've enjoyed, but so far it hasn't necessarily swept me off my feet, but I do want to give it like more time and more energy and ultimately come to a decision next year, like if I feel like this series is for me. But this series introduces us to our main character, Hadrian. And what we know of Hadrian at the beginning of book 1 is that he's a very significant figure within this galaxy. Some people laud him as a hero. Some people say he is the greatest villain of all time. Hadrian is basically recounting his life to us and all of the events that sort of occurred within this galaxy so we can ultimately come to a decision ourselves. Book 1, I would say, very much felt like a prequel novel. Book 2 has been interesting so far, but like a little bit convoluted if I'm being honest. But the scale and scope of this space opera series does really intrigue me, and I also have really enjoyed the world building of this. It's a really interesting combination of like retro futurism. It's like, yes, there's technology, yes, there's space travel, but it almost has like a medieval like feudal feeling to it, especially with the powerful families that exist within this galaxy in place. I don't know. I really want to love this. So I feel like it's worth continuing to give it a try. I honestly might even just start rereading book 2 instead of starting from the middle, which is where I got at some point last year. But yes, I want to read a few more books within this series this year and again, come to a decision. Another sci-fi series I definitely want to start is The Mercy of the Gods by James S.A. Corey. I finally completed the Expanse series last year and just adored it. James S.A. Corey's writing is just the perfect balance of like action, character work. They're just truly so unbelievably engaging, and I loved that 9-book sci-fi trilogy so much. And honestly, the timing of all of that felt so perfect because right when I was finishing The Expanse, they came out with the first book of their brand new sci-fi series that they're writing together. And this one sounds very political in a way that personally calls out to me. Basically, this is set in a future society where humanity has traveled to this new planet called the Aegean, where they've sort of settled, and how and why they've left Earth to begin with has been lost to like the sands of time. And at the beginning of the story, we're also introduced to this like hive mind empire called the Clara, who has been working to take over like the entire galaxy now for a very long time, absorbing different cultures and planets within their like larger system and empire. And at the beginning of the book, they realize that there is like this larger other enemy out in the galaxy somewhere that's a threat to them. And they feel like the only people who can possibly help them are these humans living on this planet. So they come to this planet, they ravage this planet, and they kidnap a group of humans who they expect to basically help save them and keep their empire intact. And I believe we follow these now kidnapped humans as they're forced to basically live on this entirely new planet in this empire, surrounded by other people who've also been kidnapped by like this hive mind alien group. Again, it sounds very intriguing. I really love this author's writing, as I've already mentioned. I just always feel so captured by their plot line. So I'm really hoping I just breeze through this, love it, and then I'll have a lot of other sci-fi books to read by James S.A. Corey. Alrighty, and moving on to my last grouping of books. These are all literary fiction. I really adore reading literary fiction, and I will be the first to admit that last year I did not prioritize this genre at all. This year, though, I definitely want to make sure I'm carving more space and time to read some of these novels. In particular, my husband and I kind of created this loose book club with each other. It's not necessarily like a monthly thing, but we want to read books with each other throughout the year, and we've already selected like our next 2 reads that we hope to get to very soon. First is A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ezeki. This is a book I've actually started many years ago and my husband was really intrigued by, so I'm excited to not only reread it but also finish it, but also be able to chat with him about it as well. From what I remember, this was a very emotional, very beautifully written novel with a very interesting setup and structure. Basically, the book opens with our first main character who lives on a remote island in the Pacific Northwest, and a Hello Kitty lunchbox basically washes up on the shores of her home. She opens it, and inside is actually the diary of a young girl living in Japan. And she quickly realizes that this diary must have gotten to her home all the way across the world because of the tsunami that hit Japan in 2011. And from there, we kind of get alternating perspective chapters of our main character reading this diary, as well as the young girl sort of writing this diary, and the perspectives sort of begin to blend with each other in a very interesting and emotional way. This has a lot of deep and heavy topics. Again, it was a book that I really enjoyed when I started it many years ago, and I'm really looking forward to finally completing it this year. And then the other book we're really hoping to get to in the early parts of this year is another very emotional one, but one that so many people just have said such fantastic things about, and that is Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. This is sort of a reimagining of David Copperfield, set instead in the southern Appalachian area in the United States. Particularly, this is a novel that seeks to capture the reality of the forgotten masses of the rural areas of America, the lack of funding in a lot of these towns and communities, the lack of opportunity, and the reality of sort of feeling invisible, especially to like culture and society at large. Follow the life of a young boy who's born to a teenage mother. We see him grow up in the trailer that they live in together, go to school, sort of reckon with the reality of feeling invisible. Said to try to speak to the new generation of lost boys. I am really looking forward to picking this novel up. I've heard quite literally nothing but amazing things. It did win the Pulitzer Prize, so this is a book I also hope to get to next year. From there, I also really want to read Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro, and just in general, I'm hoping to read a few more books by this author throughout 2025. I've read a couple of his books and I've really enjoyed all of them, and in particular, this is the one that's at the top of my list, as this is kind of a loose sequel to Never Let Me Go. It's set in sort of a near future reality where like AI and robots exist, and we follow our main character Clara, who is one of these robots. And Clara, who spends her days waiting patiently for the possible opportunity of being picked to live alongside a human as a companion, finally is presented with this opportunity, but the reality of this situation proves to be much more complicated than she was anticipating, and I believe we sort of watch this story unfold. I've heard that this book is really emotional, introspective. I already know I really enjoyed this author's writing quite a bit. This is also a book that's been on my TBR now for a very long time, and I feel like I truly need to get to this soon because it's getting embarrassing. And the last book on my priority 2025 TBR is Same Bed, Different Dreams by Ed Park, described as a very unique and sort of revisionist historical novel that's also full of a lot of like thrilling elements as well. Kicking this novel off, we open up in 1919 with the creation of the KPG, which is a Korean provisional government made in direct rebellion to the Japanese occupation occurring in Korea at that time. We know in our own historical timeline that ultimately this government proved to be ultimately very symbolic, and eventually the country was split in half between North and South. However, though, this novel explores the reality of what would it be like if the KPG still existed and was working towards a unified Korea, secretly pulling levers behind the scenes to further their own political aims. It says, Same Bed, Different Dreams weaves together three distinct narrative voices with an archive of mysterious images and twists reality like a kaleidoscope. Korean history, American pop culture, and our tech-fraught lives come together in this extraordinary and unforgettable novel loaded with assassins, mad poets, RPGs, slasher films, K-pop bands, and the perils of social media. This book is said to be like incredibly funny and imaginative, but also one that will really get you thinking deeply. I'm just so curious about this, and I feel like I'm gonna really, really like it. Alrighty guys, that is my priority TBR for 2025. Please let me know down below some books you hope to get to this year, as I would truly love to know. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you soon with another one soon. Goodbye.